Tengda Corporation, a global leader in businesses ranging from games, internet digital equipment, media catering, and more. In just a few years, its net worth has reached over 100 billion, and the founder of this company was Pei Qian, who started out with nothing, and a few years ago was just an ordinary college student, while today he is known as the world's best boss, a genius game developer, having an ability to manage without having to do anything, precise insight into industry trends. Today, Pei Qian, who is the young boss of the biggest company, is giving a press conference in a hall filled with flahis with huge cameras of reporters flashing from side to side. One of the journalists, wearing a standard black jacket with a tight black skirt, asked the president if he could share his experience with them, especially about how he came to achieve such high achievements. Pei Qian, in a black suit on stage, said that his success was pure luck, and his first goal was only to spend 50,000. But he didn't expect that his actions would actually lead him to the success he is today. Suddenly, the time turning to 2009. At Handong State Jingzhou City Handong University, Pei Qian seemed to be awakened by someone from his sleep, and that person said that if Pei Qian didn't get up soon, he would be late for class. Thinking that it was getting too noisy, Pei Qian didn't even start to open his eyes, thinking that him friend's voice was still as loud as a line. Faintly, the voice of him friend named Ma Yang started to become clear, and his kept shouting that they were late for the class taught by the vice-chancellor. Themselves, if they don't do it and don't have time to check in on time, they're going to be screwed later. Hearing that, Pei Qian woke up from sleep, with difficulty figuring out what his friend was talking about. But he only sees Ma Yang grinning widely, and Pei Qian screaming in fear to get away from him. Ma Yang and the Othim roommates in the room shout that they are coming, and Ma Yang also warns Pei Qian to hurry up, because if the vice-chancellor doesn't see him, thine will be big trouble. Pei Qian, with short black hair and slightly blue eyes, looked at the friends who were leaving and scratched him head. For some reason his was sick, and their bedroom felt really small, especially now that thine were 4 beds, 2 on top and 2 on the bottom. After looking around and seeing the mess in the room, he immediately noticed that thine was a lot of trash from yesterday's snacks and drinks like cola and chips strewn everywhere. Thine were dirty clothes everywhere, and Pei Qian started to notice that it was a dormitory. Of course, when Pei Qian talked about the class of the vice-chancellor, it meant that he was currently in his first year at university. Not believing his words, he realizes that he has returned to the year 2009. And if in numbers then 10 years ago, means that he has returned to the past. To confirm that this wasn't a dream, Pei Qian pinched him cheek, but it hurt, which meant his wasn't dreaming. Suddenly Pei Qian was blinded by the light, and looking ahead he saw a blue window. Thinking about what was going on, he realized that he had a system. And on the window it was written that currently the wealth conversion system was communicating with the server. A second later, a new message appeared saying that the system had successfully connected, and a new window hung in front of Pei Qian with him photo and personal information. The first is his name or Ratim Pei Qian, then company none, age 19, zodiac sign that is Scorpio, and then height that is 178 centimeters and weighs 85 kilograms. After this section ends and another section begins, it is regulated about initial capital and personal capital, and he has 50,000 initial capital and 433 personal capital. Then, in the last part, it is written that the state of the system that is being calculated, and then the state is changed to implementation of wealth transformation. Then a new window appears saying that the binding is complete, and it shows Pei Qian's face and an overview of what the system will do. The system assures that from time to time, it will give Pei Qian a fixed amount of money. This money can only be used for the company's normal commercial activities and will be entered into the table later. But later, when it is entered into the profit and loss table, it will be converted into the owner's personal assets. The profit and loss ratio would be randomly generated, and seeing this, Pei Qian started nodding, saying that, as expected after system rebirth, should be given as a gift, and it was common when one was returned to the past. The system issued a new information. It said that the profit conversion rate was 100 to 1, while the loss conversion rate was 1 to 1. The system also told the person to be familiar with the rules. Seeing all this, Pei Qian realized that the system not only gave him startup capital, but would also give him money regardless of whether the business was profitable or not, and that was just a slightly wrong conversion rate. Pei Qian thought that if he spent 50,000 data by the system and made 100,000, then based on a 100-to-1 conversion rate, he would get only 1,000 yuan. But if he spent all 50,000, then based on 1-to-1 exchange rate, then he would get back 50,000s that have been lost from his account. Smiling an evil smile, he shouted that it didn't look like his future would be cloudy. The system displays a new window while it asks for a name for the company. Pei Qian thought that the company he headed would die eventually, and thus, after thinking a bit, he decided to call it Soaring Tengda Company. A new message came saying that the registration was successful, and the results will be withdrawn in 14 days, and also a note saying that the calculation may be postponed. Seeing this kindness, Pei Qian says that it wouldn't be bad to finish it since it's easier to spend money than to earn it, and moreover, he benefits from the extra 10 years experience, remembering that he is someone who came from the future and was thrown back 10 years. Different from him previous life, this time Pei Qian would stay away from industries that would allow him to earn money, and his plan to use him money only to spend it. Then a question arose in Pei Qian's mind. Which industry should he choose? In Pei Qian's head and mind, the meeting begins. 5 of Pei Qian's chibi sit in front of a round table, while one of them slams a gavel on the table and says that the first meeting about spending money is declared open. The head of the 5 asked who would be first, and the bespectacled Pei Qian made a bid. Pei Qian in glasses carefully flips through his ETS, saying that based on the system's detailed rules mentioning more than 200 violations, legal activities are prohibited, and the choice of still not so large, the system narrows the range of actions, and if they do this, they will be puni his D. This world is no different from usual. It's just that in this world, technology develops a little faster, and copyright protection is stronger. One of the Uthim 5 Pei Qian listens to him, saying that since time is advanced technology and copyright protection, then how about getting into game development students? Pei Qian is surprised by this suggestion, and player Pei Qian continues to explain by saying that it takes a lot of money to develop a game, and any changes might cost more money. Student Pei Qian adjusted his glasses and nodded, saying that indeed, the material goods industry will still have assets to sell after bankruptcy. But this is not the case with profits. They can't sell a lot of code that doesn't need to be paid for. Pei Qian, who was sipping tea, said that Pei Qian needed to remember what would happen in the next 10 years. It was enough for them to avoid games that would become popular all over, because then no one would buy their games, and that was the fastest way to spend money. Pei Qian all agrees to this, and thus their journey to spend money begins. Step 1, create a game. Second step, pay to change system funds to private. And step 3, spend it all. Pei Qian all shouts that they will do it. They end the meeting and so on. Pei Qian smilingly decides to invest in the failed game development and become the richest man who keeps losing money. Pei Qian was currently sitting in front of the computer in the room and yawning from exhaustion, making simple games on several machines. He whined that he couldn't do it, and that it was very difficult to make a game suitable for sale. Fortunately, there is an Ezro platform, where here Pei Qian can buy a game set and process everything in the editor. Now it remains only to release and submit it for verification. If Pei Qian kept spending money on making games that no one would ever buy, he would have time to enter negative territory in 2 weeks. The driving simulator game took 20,000 yuan from him, and he still had to spend money on the internal and external design of the car driving in the desert at a price of 23,000 yuan just for the background, of course expensive. But Pei Qian thought that this was what was needed. Radio station 6,000, the remaining yuan and 1,000 was spent on a simple level system, imagining that he would cook all of this in any pot like a witch's jug. Pei Qian nodded to himself, saying that he looked simple as if he had forgotten something. There was nothing special about the ordinary driving simulator. It would be bad if his work passed. Pei Qian, by clicking his finger on a new idea, he quickly started adding it, To move to the next level, the player has to play at least 8 hours long, and there will be turns from time to time. With such a game, it is doomed to fail. Pei Qian says that he is a genius, and Pei Qian starts to apply all of this to the game. 2 hours later, he already has something very different from the original product. This should fail the test, and Pei Qian decides that it would just be a stupid waste of time. So Pei Qian decides to try on the spot. He started the game and ended up in the car. The car went and went without turning and nothing, just in a straight line. More than 10 minutes had passed, and Pei Qian was already feeling tired. With a stupid face, Pei Qian saw this. He couldn't even believe that he had made a game this bad. It was so monotonous, but then smiled evilly. He said that this couldn't be considered a driving simulator at all. Rather, it was monotonous torture with this kind of gameplay. And then players will start cursing it all they can. No one will be able to make money on this game for sure. Pei Qian smiled, dropped the joystick, and leaned back in the chair with a laugh. With such a loathsome game, he would surely lose money, and so his plan would work. Back at the Handong University dormitory, in Pei Qian's room, the 4 occupants were playing games, and in the middle of the game, Ma Yang, who was also playing ramen at the same time, said that Pei Qian had completely lost his fear, and in general, how much longer would he have skip class? Pei Qian, who was playing, shouted loudly at him to shut up and finish eating faster. Otherwise, they always lose team battles because of him in the game. One of them leaves and he screams that he's gone. Pei Qian screams at Ma Yang. Pei Qian asks if he's still alive, but at that moment everyone leaves. There's 3-on-1, but they're still beaten. Can they play at all or no? And now, large text with a special explosion effect appeared on the computer screen, which made Pei Qian lose face. Pei Qian looked at his stats and winced that he got a kill-death assist score of February 7th, 11, and with such a result he lost face. Ma Yang, who only had a kill-death assist score of 222, told him to play well if he wanted to be fed. Pei Qian was speechless, thinking that Ma Yang had completely lost his fear. He had only been farming the whole game, and now he was accused of not being able to play. Pei Qian's roommate named Ma Yan was her friend for 4 years in university. Now, with the way she opens a new packet of noodles and eats again. Whatever she does, she is serious. She has an average academic record. She is not very strong in the game, but he is not too weak either. In principle, he is a classic example of jack of all trades, master of none. While Ma Yang enthusiastically said that he needed to play one more round, and everyone supported him well, except Pei Qian, who said he wanted to sleep so he wouldn't play. Also, he had to get up early. Pei Qian yawned and got up from the table and walked to the bed, plopped into it, and picked up his smartphone and started thinking about his game again. If he spent all the money on the game, what would happen next? He would only have to wait 2 weeks to get 50,000 in his pocket. No better than making money. Pei Qian had a smile on his face. He immediately imagined everything he thought about game consoles, new computer cases, laptops, and joysticks. Just thinking of all this, he opened one video, and he watched it. In City Random Apartment, where cobwebs and mold appeared in the corners and the walls were cracked, the person sitting in front of the computer side seemed to be done with the game. It was Chao Liang, the streamer and moderator, who got up from the floor and turned on Kettle. He sadly said that if he didn't get enough views today, he would never get a sponsor. And besides, if he didn't get a sponsor, there would be no money, and he still had bills for the month. Chao sat down at the table again. He found a game with a desert on the cover titled Lonely Desert Highway. After saying that this was nonsense, it turned out that not long ago he went in and saw that it was only $1. The game description says that this is a driving simulator that will make players reconsider their life choices. Grinning, Chao bought the game and thought about how this was a $1 game. When Chao started playing the game, made him think it was a picture of a horrible desert. It was the same thing all the time in the sultry desert, where the wind dragged the sand all the time, covering the screen, with parts of the player driving a red truck with a very sharp steering wheel. Uncomfortable, and the background music is so dark that it doesn't suit a simple driving simulator at all. For someone experienced in bad games like Chao, it was a classic of bad games. He had been used to this for a long time. but something was wrong. He felt strange somehow. He had been driving through this wasteland for quite a while, but there were no surprises, or a twist that strengthens his heart. Chow told herself that there would be 10 more minutes of this game. 10 minutes passed easily, but nothing changed, and moreover an hour passed. Because of that, Chow started to think about different things who she was, what did she do at all, what she wanted to do, other than how to drive all the time. Chow was already pale, cursing at the thought of developers simply leaving a twist here and there without any hitches or events, except for a turn here and there. Suddenly a realization came to Chow. Doesn't this bleak path remind you of a stagnant and miserable life? And because the game was taking so long, his stomach was growling, and he decided to take a break to eat and then continue. But by pressing the joystick button to pause, he turned pale and angry, because this damn game couldn't even be paused. What's wrong with this game? Out of anger, he forgets to turn left, which causes the truck to crash into a boulder, and try again appears on the screen. Because of this, the man's eyes pop out from under his glasses. Angrily, he screams inside he's been driving for an hour and a half, so the game is just to tell him to start back. He screams that he has to eat now, and then see how this shit beats him. Besides that, he wants to make content from his channel to play this game. 2 weeks later, in the Handong University dormitory in Pei Qian's room, she sits in front of the computer and watches Chow. Chow also explains to those watching about the game and how bad it was during the 8-hour journey. The players have to keep staring at the screen because every few minutes there is a turn, and if the players miss it and don't give up the time, then they will lose. And at the same time, they will be immersed in everyday life, and they will have to start the game from the beginning. And then, Mo Yang shouted. What surprised him the most was his brilliant move at the end of the game, as if he was taunting the player, whereupon the game ended with just a few sentences in the middle of the screen. That is, he was congratulating the player on the fact that he had managed to waste 8 hours of his life in vain. After the game was over, Chow shouted across the table that this game helps players think about life and the possibility of helping him. Also, there are a lot of comments in the comments of the video. For example, the comment from I Like Bullying Noobs, saying that she never wasted the whole 8-hour section in the video and also started thinking about life. Or, for example, Adorable Loli wrote that she had bought the game and wished finding the meaning of life in the desert. Underneath the color of love is a +1 sign that he also bought the game. Watching all these comments, Pei Qian clutched his head, thinking about why and how his play got into the show, talking about free games and in general why the audience was so enthusiastic about what was going on at all. Pei Qian wrote in a fit of rage that this game sucks and isn't worth buying, and moreover, he's writing on behalf of the author and immediately receiving comments and responses, one by the tearful nickname Hidetaka Miyazaki telling him not to worry because they love it. The other by the name G Fat said, of course, they knew it sucked, but it was only $1, so he had to take their money. Another one with the nickname Blizzard's Die Hard Fan, who passionately said the game was cool, and even asked him to make a mobile version. Reading all these comments, Pei Qian gave up and said that there must be something wrong with this world, or maybe there is something wrong with it. Could he be crazy? He makes games that suck so much but still attract streamers, and for some reason the reviews are so good. With the despair of Pei Qian being called the system, as usual his face is there, and after that there is a status with a non-existent company, age 19 zodiac sign that is Scorpio, and 178 centimeters tall. In the second group, his initial assigned capital is 125,463.5, and in brackets, it says that he received an income of 75,463.5 yuan from the first game, but his additional assets are now being read by the system. After some time, the system calculated the capital, and he only got 754.6. Pei Qian, with a pale face, mentally screams that his 50,000 just disappeared. And to prevent this from happening again, he holds a Pei Qian meeting at his head again, and the Pei Qian chief informs him of the situation, saying that the meeting is open and knocks table with a hammer. Then he said with a mute face that he didn't expect their game to sell 20,000 copies. Once the platform takes its share, they will receive a 70,000 fee. The bespectacled Pei Qian, after calculating everything said based on the conversion rate, they will only receive 700 yuan. Pei Qian, who is drinking tea with tears in his eyes, says that there is no point in being sad. So now they need to think about how to spend the next 50,000. Then Pei Qian stupidly suggests asking anyone for help, and everyone gets thinking and starts discussing it. After a few minutes, Pei Qian screams that it's perfect because there are people who never get anything and somehow always manage to ruin everything. He is immediately supported by the other Pei Qian, saying that person will surely pull the team down. He is what they need. And when the conference was over, all the positive candidates smiled. After that, Ma Yang then came in and said that he had something to eat here. It was Pei Qian's best friend, Ma Yang. Pei Qian smiled. She immediately approached him and thanked him, adding that when Ma Yang was around, he thought everything was in its place. Pei Qian put his hand on Ma Yang's shoulder. Pei Qian said that Ma Yang was his only beam of hope. Meanwhile, in a diner where tables were set out on the street and people were ordering various items like chicken wings, both Ma Yang and Pei Qian were sitting watching how Ma Yang was without knowing the problem. Pei Qian thought that now that he had a system of 300,000, it would be okay to hire someone. Ma Yang, savoring every bite, asked the man why he suddenly decided to treat him. Did he win the lottery or had something to deal with? Pei Qian recalled his missing 50,000. Pei Qian dryly said that something like that. The man saw again the systemic transformation of wealth. After adding up the funds, he was given another 300,000 and totaled it in 30 days. Now his system account is 300,000 and his personal account is only 907. While the man looked at the window, Ma Yang said he likes braised chicken wings, almost cried and drank Coke. Pei Qian thought that he had tried really hard and only got 900 yuan in the account. While looking at phone, he calculates system account. It seems system account has proper value, and after each recalculation, everything that is lacking will be replenished by system. The next recalculation was in 30 days. This time, Pei Qian needed to find a way to spend 300,000. Ma Yang saw the yard iron not eating anything, asked why he just sat down and offered to eat. Pei Qian doesn't listen to him, saying that he has started game development and needs an assistant. Then he asked Ma Yang what would he say for such a thing. Was he interested in such a thing? Surprised Ma Yang, he said that games devour money into accounts. And where did Pei Qian get it? Pei Qian clenched his fingers and took a serious pose. Pei Qian says that he will no longer hide the truth from his friends, and therefore lies that he is the son of a tycoon, and his family gave him 300,000 as initial capital. Ma Yang looked at the man in shock, and Pei Qian smirked inside, thinking how this Ma Yang could believe his lies. Ma Yan asks Pei Qian if she even knows how to program or design. Of course, she replies that she doesn't. But then she says with a smile that it doesn't really matter, Pei Qian can buy files on the internet and then add something special in there. Opens Cola. Ma Yang sadly says they know nothing about game development, and if they only spent 300,000, it is somehow wrong. Hearing this, Pei Qian became angry because of such an invisible consciousness. Waving his fist, he did not believe that he would not be able to persuade Ma Yang. Then Pei Qian needed to use his trump card. Coughing, Pei Qian asked young boy if he ever heard of lonely desert road picking, picked up a bottle of Coley and drank it. Maybe Young said that yes, it's some kind of lame game recently become quite popular pecky, and smilingly said he made it. Ma Yang sprayed the drunken chef out of shock, and Pei Qian barely managed to dodge it. Then a shocked Ma Yang slapped the table and stood up screaming, asking the man if he was the creator of the Lonely Desert Highway, much to Ma Yang's surprise. Smiling madly, Ma Yang gave a thumbs up and said he didn't know his brother had the kind of talent needed to have such good skills to make the game so popular. Pointing at himself, Ma Yang said that if that was the case, then he was willing to work with him. He may not be very good at all of this, but at this he can be trusted. Shouted that he would, and went to the bookstore to buy some books. Ma Yang got up and ran towards the shop. He promised that he would not let his brother down. Pei Qian wanted to stop him but couldn't see the enthusiastic Ma Yang. The man wondered if it was worth hiring. Later that same night in the dorm, as the man was sitting at the computer, Ma Yang walked into the room with a large stack of books, screaming that he was back. Seeing this, Pei Qian asked in surprise why they needed so many books. Ma Young says that the others are on sale, so he grabs them too. While seeing the book his friend Pei Qian brought, looks at him in shock. This idiot even thought about neck aches and hair loss. But after all, programmers' most important problem was pressure, and don't stress this. And besides, Ma Yang wasn't even a programmer. Smiled Pei Qian and gave a thumbs up and said that it seemed like Ma Yang was just what he needed. Ma Yang took one book and said he was thinking about starting with top-level coding. For a fool, the contents were huge, and even though Ma Yang knew all the words individually, but when they were together he did not understand a word. Smiling, Pei Qian thought to herself that she had told her friend these books would not help her, but would only take up space in the room. Pei Qian saw a friend said that they would focus on design, not coding. In addition, after the boom in the technology industry, most of the information from these books was outdated, and an angry Ma Yang clutched the book saying that it was no wonder that books it is discounted, because the store does not have returns on goods purchased at a discount. Waving, Pei Qian told a friend he could see there might be something useful in there. Besides, he could file a complaint against the manufacturing company. Ma Yang heard this clarified if he could definitely make a complaint, and Pei Qian said definitely take the book. Ma Yang said it was time to give it a try, and after a few tens of minutes, Pei Qian saw his friend sleeping with a book on his face, slapping him across the face. Pei Qian clenched his fists, thinking that his friend's efforts deserved 100 points, but his ability was 0 points. This was what he needed, someone who was diligent but incompetent. Too bad Ma Yang was the only one he knew with such talent. If he could hire Ma Yang more people like that, then wouldn't he be rich in a second? Cool Ma Yang Troop thought about this on the male side, and then cheered up. He stretched, thinking that he needed to decide what to do next. Now the road to losing 300,000 yen start is what they need. Got up from the bed, Ma Yang saw Qian Pei holding a card in his hand and rubbed his eyes, asked if they would make a mobile card game, and the man of course not. He said he would develop a mobile card game based on the Three Kingdoms. He even bought a template map. Pei Qian stood with his blue hoodie lifted as the card spoke, got off the bed. Ma Yang asked about the fact that this idea came not because Qian Pei noticed that Three Kingdoms was quite successful, and he wanted to make games following his example. Ma Yang had heard that many people make a mobile card game now. After reaching into his pocket, Ma Yang took out the phone and showed the rankings, saying that Three Kingdoms was to be someone's cliché just by looking at game ratings. There were 5 out of 10 games that were written off from Three Kingdoms. Scratches her chin. Pei Qian smiles, thinking that this is why she is doing this. She decides to make a mobile card game since they have such a great competition. If Three Kingdoms was that popular, then he too would make a game based on it if. So many identical games strive for success that his game is bound to be forgotten, and this time he's bound to lose, and he collects the payoff. Meeting Pei Qian at his head again slamming the hammer is the main Pei Qian asking about who will start. And as usual, the man with glasses is the first to raise his hand, shouting that he will start. Smiled Chief Pei Qian said it would be good to let Pei Qian's students speak. The man with glasses took the sheets and told everyone to pay attention to his next words. Three Kingdoms has a more complex payment system than other mobile card games. Pei Qian sold the game for 5 people, but the donation reached 1,000 yen. The player Paint with the joystick suggested making the donation requirement higher, so that the players would complain, and thus not donate. Pei Qian's student adjusts his glasses and says that if the players behave differently, they can't know for sure that it will win. It doesn't work that some fat man will recoup all expenses, then all losses will turn into profits. Then Pei Qian was smart this time, with coffee in hand, saying that because of that they should move in opposite directions, so the fat people cannot roll over even if they want to. The lazy Pei Qian suggested that the Three Kingdoms that others sold for 5 yuan they sold for 10 yuan, and others said that after buy in the game, Pei Qian can only buy Immortal VIP status for 30 and nothing. Besides raising his hand wrong, one of them said that the costs would be minimal, and it would be very difficult to get the money out. The scheme seems to be an expensive entrance. Spending money to buy the game, plus the low cost for the game is nowhere to spend. The money in this game will be a good plan. After all, the poor will be scared because of the price and will think that the donation will be higher and will not buy. But the rich who still buy the game will understand that there is nothing to spend money in this game and will not win quickly. Pei Qian started showing the template to Ma Yang, saying that the template had been purchased. There was Crusade Raid PvP and other modes. Seeing this, Ma Yang scratched his head, saying in surprise that he now understood what kind of pattern it was. The man smiled at the thought of the new gameplay where not everything would be completely normal, which would further alienate the players. Ma Yang realized the same thing and shouted in shock that it was only a template that cost 100,000. Pei Qian said with a smile that it was pocket change, but he thought that it was bad that the template cost only 100,000. It was too cheap, even if it cost 150,000. Pei Qian was about to buy this template, then pointed at the screen. Pei Qian continued explaining the next steps after purchasing the template would be interface development, combat, effects, map display, and whatnot. Ma Yang turned pale, thinking that money had to be spent on all of these, and then he asked what the design budget was. They raised 3 fingers. Pei Qian says that he has prepared 30,000 for music and sound effects and 10,000 for everything else. The remaining 60,000 will go to design. After saying that, Pei Qian slapped the table. After writing all these advances, Qian heaved a sigh of relief and handed a bundle of papers to Ma Yang, saying that he was done with the planning, so Ma Yang had to see them smile. Pei Qian said that all the visuals and effects would be on him, and he would leave the development of the map to Ma Yang, wiping the sweat from his forehead with a handkerchief. He messes up. Pei Qian slaps him on the shoulder and screams at his friend not to worry because he trusts her. After all, he needed a character to be non-standard and bold original. Ma Yang, looking at the pile of papers, said that he would try. Smiling, Pei Qian tells her that she is sure her friend will succeed. And Pei Qian thinks to herself that if Ma Yang understands the 3 kingdoms, she won't trust him with it. After a while, Ma Yang held his head, screaming that he couldn't. He didn't even know where to start. Smiling, Pei Qian told Ma Yang to relax. After all, how the character would look depended on the designer. All Ma Yang needed was an outline of an idea, but he had to remember that it had to be something new and non-standard. Ma Yang thought for a moment and asked the man if he could make Guan Yu a dragon. Giving a thumbs up, Pei Qian said of course he could, so the interrogation began. While Ma Yang asks if he can make Ma Chao a centaur and Pei Qian agrees, then Ma Yang will ask if he can make Zhou Kong a dragon woman, and Pei Qian will agree again. Ma Yang introduced a lowly beauty with silver hair, asked if he could make Lu Meng as a lowly dragon. Ma Yang smiled. Pei Qian slapped him on the shoulder and said that it was amazing. Ma Yang was a genius, but he imagined men like women and thought that he had found the right person. Just imagine that Zhou Chang is a dragon lady and Lu Meng is a lowly dragon. That would be a great masterpiece. Pei Qian searched the internet for information. That person realized that the characters in the 3 kingdoms are now popularly chibi, which means that the chibi style is more popular among players, so they will move towards realism. They will go in the direction of what people don't like, and now it's time to look for artists. And he soon found an artist named Ruan Guangjian. The portfolio looks good at only 800 yuan per card. Apart from beginners, she has a portfolio in chibi style, so most likely she is not good at drawing and realism. She wrote a business proposal to Pei Qian and clicked enter, down the offer for novice artists who don't know how to draw in realism. Isn't that a reason to curse the player for the developer? And by readily creating a template without new gameplay, it costs 10 yuan to buy and 30 yuan to pump. At this speed, it will be very easy to lose 300,000 and gain 300,000. In the student canteen of Handong University, one sunny day, many students were eating, and among the students were Ma Yang and Pei Qian. Ma Yang diligently ate his lunch of chicken, but Pei Qian saw through Ma Yang's work, thinking he had done a good job. Unknowingly, from what he read, his lips crawled up, and he thought to himself that the list of requirements well enough certainly fit his criteria, and would be better left blank altogether. In short, all in vain. Put a finger up. Pei Qian smiled at her friend with all her teeth and said, as she expected, Ma Yang had done the impossible. He himself would not have thought of such a thing, and he thought that there was nothing in common with the three kingdoms, except for a few characteristics and names. Ma Yang breathed a sigh of relief and stood up for a while, saying that he had a crazy idea. The man started waiting, asking what kind of idea it was, and Ma Yang suggested making all the divine soldiers of the three kingdoms female, and said that would be even cooler. Hearing this, Pei Qian feels like an electric shock and throws a pile of papers on the table. She stands up and screams that this definitely can't be happening. Shocked, doesn't understand why her brother is so excited, asks why she reacted like that, and she herself says that it's something that totally new. Embarrassed by her impulsiveness, Pei Qian sits back down and coughs and looks away, saying that character will lose its uniqueness. Then he said that if they made her a girl, then they wouldn't join each other, and he thought to himself that if they did that, then the game could skyrocket. Then, smiling, Pei Qian reassures his friend, saying that he has done everything perfectly. Ma Chao is a centaur, Guan Yu is a dragon. They will be easy to spot. After understanding Pei Qian's words, Ma Yang said that he seemed to understand. Pei Qian got up from his seat, returned the documents to Ma Yang, and told him to transfer all of this to the computer, and Pei Qian herself to discuss everything with the artist. Ma Yang easily agrees, and Pei Qian secretly thanks God that Ma Yang is so stupid. Thanks to this, she can easily fool him. In the city of Mo, more beautiful, filled with skyscrapers shining in the sunbeams of beautiful buildings in this city. At Mo City University of Economics and Finance, in the dormitory of the Faculty of Arts, in one of the rooms, a man with brown eyes and a beautiful hairstyle in a yellow jacket and brown turtleneck was sitting in front of a computer wearing a black hood, asking the sitting man that he was definitely not lying and actually got an order, and the bespectacled man asked what conditions followed. Ruan Guangjian, who was sitting concentrating on dialogue with customers, waved to his friends, telling them to be quiet and not disturb. Now he was dealing with customers, and whether or not he would eat meat next month depended on the fact that he would receive it. Looking at the chat window, Guangjian imagines that they are in a courtroom, and he looks at the customer, assuming an imposing look. Guangjian turned the pen with his finger and asked the interlocutor how much he needed and what his special wish was, to which Pei Qian raised his hand and said that he didn't need chibi or artistic style, and the rest didn't matter. In general, Pei Qian requires 50 characters and 4 images each for a total of 200 images. Surprised, Guangjian wondered if he had read correctly because all his works are in the chibi portfolio, but the customer's main requirement is not to draw chibi. Guangjian nodded at this question. On the Guangjian side said that he agreed, but the price will be 2,000 per character. He knows it is expensive for a beginner, but the customer needn't worry because he is very capable. Hearing that, Guangjian turned pale. 2,000 per character wasn't that 500 per picture. He wouldn't be able to spend all the money like that. Therefore, Pei Qian raised his hand in protest and said that he was dissatisfied with the price. When Guangjian heard this, he said the price couldn't be lower anyway. Pei Qian took a piece of paper and slapped it, saying this time they wanted to do something non-standard, so it would be harder to work. Besides that, their planners weren't skilled in the art at all, so the requirements weren't very precise. After finishing her speech, Pei Qian slapped the table and raised her hand with 3 fingers up, saying that she thought 3,000 yuan per character was a fair payment. Hearing this, Guangjian clenched his fist, which even caused his pencil to break. The man couldn't believe it was called a reverse transaction because he didn't know the other person's feelings. Pei Qian sent him a file and said that this was a list he had to see. After opening it and seeing its contents, the artist fell into a stupor. Then when he came to his senses, he sighed and asked Pei Qian if he didn't think that the terms were a bit vague. It would be hard to draw since there wasn't even an example. Pei Qian's interlocutor calmed down, telling him not to worry. He relied on artist skills, shouldn't panic. When she was done, Pei Qian would accept everything and would not ask to redo it. She could even take screenshots of the written words to use as evidence later, and they could also include it in the contract. Surprised by this, Guangjian scratched his head and said that they should sign a digital contract. Pei Qian smiled with all his mouth, saying that he saw no problem in this, and signed the contract. In fact, he thinks that everything is ready, so he just needs to buy the music and sound effects, rent a save cloud and so on within 10,000 as a backup. He doesn't want to spend money on marketing, and he thinks it would be better if no one knew about the game. At this time, Guangjian called his friends, saying that they had work. The black-hooded one looked at the price of 3,000 yuan for the character, said that was good. The man in glasses complimented it, saying that for that kind of money he would draw a chibi via force. Guangjian also chilled their order, saying that this time it wasn't a chibi. The client told him that they can draw in any style except chibi. Who was shocked by this? The man in the black hood said that he remembered exactly how Guangjian put only chibi in the portfolio, and at the same time the client still said that he didn't need chibi. This client seems to have gone mad. Guangjian insulted a friend, told him to go for tea because it was called insight, not madness. Then Guangjian clenched his fists and said that he hated drawing chibi, because now all mobile games are with chibi characters. Guangjian had no choice. He needed a job, so he drew chibi. But now this is no longer needed, because he has a chance to show how valuable he is in drawing that not chibi. Showing friends pictures with the Minotaur and a laptop, Guangjian said he chose an epic black style with oil paint effect. The formidable Minotaur brandished a large axe. The Minotaur's complexion was gray, but his eyes were shining with red madness. His hair was brown and the handkerchief tied around his hips was red. The bespectacled man who saw this said he had 2 questions. The first is whether this style meets the customer's requirements. Guangjian pushed up from his chair and turned his chair around, telling his friends that he wanted to convey a heroic feeling, and appearance is the most significant factor. In short, the more different appearance of human, the better. Leaning against the railing, Guangjian continued to say that bluntly playing in the Three Kingdoms style usually does not match this style. But in the list of requirements, the characters of the Three Kingdoms have been redesigned, so now this style is quite suitable. Now the bespectacled man asked the second question that interested them. He said that Guangjian were the only ones who could draw in this style. They would not have succeeded in the same way. Guangjian smiled, telling them not to worry. He would design the characters and do the lines, and they should help him fix everything, and Guangjian would make the final touches in the end. If they acted like this, they would definitely fall into style. A man in a black hoodie says he agrees and accepts the job. They had no clients, so they had to test the ground if the style turned out to be unpopular. Then in any case, the customer would lose money. Then the guy in glasses went on for her to say that, but if the style becomes popular, they might even be able to set up their own studio after graduation. Guangjian raised his hand, saying that this is good, then they should do everything in the best possible way and make a name for themselves. His friends immediately raised their fists and shouted with him. The 3 weeks passed very quickly, although for most artists, and especially for Guangjian, it was the most hellish 3 weeks of his life. He finally finished his work emaciated, and with black bags under his eyes, he threw down the graphic pencil and said he was done. Standing smiling, he said that everyone has done a good job, so they should celebrate. But when he woke up, he saw his friends sleeping like corpses from exhaustion. But their room was like a garbage dump. There were cans of coffee, cola, and other energy drinks lying around. While scratching his head, Guangjian said, since everyone is asleep, he will please them with lunch tomorrow, and then with a sigh, he sits down and writes a letter to Pei Qian the next morning. In Handong University dormitory, Pei Qian sees a message in a file from an artist in her room. When the file is being downloaded, Pei Qian calls the system and looks at it. As soon as there is the name of the owner, that is Pei Qian, the conversion rate is nailed 100 to 1. In the lost conversion rate is 1 to 1, as well as the next sum, which is in 8 days. In the next paragraph, there is a note saying that if product publication does not occur more than a week before the summation date, then the date is postponed. A new date is determined by the system. In the third paragraph, there is a system account bill of 87.92 and a personal account of 1607 net worth. Seeing this, Pei Qian thought that 3,000 of the remaining 8,000 was Ma Yang's salary, but he could only pay it at the end of the month. There were still 5,000 needed, and they would be spent before the sum day, thinking about where to spend it. Pei Qian decided then to take a look at the resource station and buy something from there. Of course, she needed to clear the system account in today's way. Pei Qian wasn't wearing the usual white t-shirt with hieroglyphs, but she was wearing a white hoodie and a blue short jacket over it. The file was finally downloaded, and in the hope that the artist didn't know how to draw, he went to the file and saw their formidable dragon in a humanoid shape with a spear in his hand. And in the clothes of the military leader of that time, there were lights in the background, and the style was really cool. Seeing this page, Pei Qian rose sharply and he turned pale, and after a while he shouted that this picture was too professional to cost only 700 yuan. Approached the screen tightly, he said that they were making fun of him. All the drawings were up to a standard he couldn't believe that they were drawn by the same Ruan. Guangzhan cries, clutching Pei Qian's head mentally, shouting about why he has such a beautiful creation, why his entire portfolio, rather than in chibi style as a matter of urgency, he arranges for a meeting in his head. All of Pei Qian clutched their heads and looked at the table. Chief Pei Qian was the first to consciously slam the gavel down on the table and said that they all knew they couldn't break the contract and the game had to be released in 2 days, at which point the system would delay the sum date. Therefore, they had to think about what course of action to take. They can take. The bespectacled Pei Qian adjusted her glasses and told everyone to calm down as things weren't as bad as they seemed. Although these pictures are nice, players may not like them. Pei Qian intellectually holds back over a cup of coffee, saying that it can be so, not to mention their game is using an old template. The game is boring and they spend some of the remaining money so the game is empty. The lazy Pei Qian raised his hand and also held his brother, saying that people would never know about the game because they didn't advertise it. And therefore, where they were going to see the art, they needed to avoid words that could bring the game to trend, and especially the mention of the 3 kingdoms. When they submitted it to the platform for verification, Pei Qian needed to keep the name and description of the game disc simple. It was better to see that all this would be funny. This was a sure time. They would be able to fail the game. At this time, Ma Yang appears behind Pei Qian's back and asks where she is looking, and seeing art pointing at her, she asks in surprise that it is for character. Pei Qian smilingly said it was all thanks to Ma Yang's description he gave to artists for inspiration. Surprised, Ma Yang smiles, saying that he didn't know he had a talent for Pei Qian. This gave way to a friend asking him to check the game for bugs. If not there, they could have let him go already. Ma Yang, of course, agreed, sat down at Ma Yang's table, then looked at Pei Qian with hope, and asked what the name of the game would be. Pei Qian said that it would be Ghost General, a regular card game. On the other side of Guangzhan and Company, for the first time in a long time, the students had managed to throw such a party, thanks to the fact that their last orders had finally been completed. Guangzhan, who organized this party, told his friends and part-time employees to try the lamb chop. He told them to eat it while it was hot. He also encouraged everyone to drink and have fun because today they had a special day, and they had to get drunk. Guangzhan's friend was skeptical. The guy asked the guy for what game they drew so much, and when it will come out. Guangzhan scratched his cheek and said he doesn't remember exactly, but it seems the game is called Ghost General, and he didn't ask about the release date, so he doesn't know when. He saw his friends staring at him too intently. He sighed and said that he would now look at the release date of the game, and when he found it in a search engine, he exclaimed and was shocked that it was out. The bespectacled man was also surprised by this and asked to clarify whether Guangzhan had sent the picture in the morning. How could they release it in the afternoon of the same day? Then he and 2 other friends started looking into their phone, and when they found it, they were shocked. The bespectacled man was surprised to find the game description stating that this was a normal card game, and he asked with displeasure, wasn't it too half-assed? The others with blue eyes exclaimed in surprise that it seemed the makers of this game made Lonely Desert Highway, when noticing the higher price of market the same game and asked if someone bought this game for the tenner. Guangzhan said that he had bought that. They needed to see the game they had been pirating for days. The bespectacled man says he trained and now 10 gotcha. After 1 round, he got straight 2 orange cards at once. Maybe he was too lucky. But he had no time to rejoice because one friend after another said that they had 2 of them, and one had 3. Guangjian scratched his head, suggesting that perhaps it was because the game was in the testing phase that there were more chances of getting rare cards. Suddenly, the bespectacled man showed his phone, telling Guangjian to look at the store, and there was a VIP status icon. Only his other friend with blue hair said that there are only 10 additional gachas every day. Isn't that a waste? And what about the premium system? There are already 8 levels in 3 kingdoms. Guangjian asked his friends if it was worth asking Boss Pei this. Maybe there is a special factor, or maybe this is not the final version of the game. His friends nodded, and because of that, Guangjian started sending chats to Pei Qian. He writes to Pei Qian that he noticed that there are no premium systems in the game, and only one thing in store. Then he requested all of them as such because the game is not yet in testing phase, and everything will be added in final version. But in response, Pei Qian received only a curt reply that this was the final version, and here they were again in their imaginary court. Guangjian couldn't believe what he had read, asking what happened to the store. Then Pei Qian smirked and said that they only sell membership cards, and they won't add anything else to the shop. Guangjian was in shock, but after calming down, he asked why they were doing this. Pei Qian took a piece of paper and said that other things are not needed. Their strategy involves setting price constants. Why did they add in-game purchases? At first, they even thought of not adding a membership card purchase for 30 yuan, but then they thought a little and decided that some players might need it, so they decided to add it. Guangjian then asked about the promotion of the game. The game has only a few downloads now, probably because they haven't started promoting it yet. Pei Qian spread his hands and said they would not promote it. Surprised, Guangjian asked that they did not go to do it at all. Guangjian sighed heavily and looked sad and said that they had no money. They spent 300,000 buying design templates, music and sound effects, and rented the cloud, so there was no more money left. And here we are again in the real world. Guangjian was more gloomy than the others after talking to Pei Qian. His friends asked him what Pei Qian wrote. Guangjian pondered for a moment what to do, and then nodded to himself, clasped his fists, and stood up and said that the ghost general needed him. Then he started to explain what he meant. He started to explain, or rather retell, his conversation with Pei Qian. And within 10 minutes, his friends knew about the situation. And after discussion, Guangjian said that initially he thought Pei Qian was very rich, so he didn't ask for a discount and even raised the price. The bespectacled man drinking beer asked confusedly that Pei Qian had paid so much, didn't he want to get at least the money spent? Guangjian clasped his fists and said that it seemed that this case Pei Qian was the right person, so he didn't need so much money. The blue eye leaned back in the chair, saying that no matter how much money was in the game, it was impossible to make the game popular without promotion. The blue-haired one also asked if they should help with the promotion of the game. The bespectacled man said that if they were internet celebrities or streamers, then they could help with advertisements, but they had no funds. Guangjian slammed his hands on the table and stood up and said that Pei Qian had treated them generously, so they should return the favor. Guangjian looked for phone contacts. He said that many famous artists studied with him in the group. He decided to try to persuade them to help with the case. It was late, and in the university dormitory in Pei Qian's room, Ma Yang was looking through the game page with a sad face, seeing that there was no download. He asked his friend if the game was really that bad. Nobody interested him at all. Pei Qian, who heard this, was of course happy. Ma Yang looked at him and said that another new game has several million downloads. Then why do they only have a few parts? But Pei Qian just comforted a friend who smiled smugly. He thought about how everything was set up. The game didn't even have an influence channel, so where did the download come from? Ma Yang, who was wearing his yellow sweater, sighed and said he wanted to take another look at the game. He wondered if there had been any changes. After a few hours of smirking at his friend's naive salary, Pei Qian says that he thought that only 3 hours had passed and what changes might have come out. From the question that there are 3 hours, but not even 3 days, not even 3 months to change anything, they don't even pay attention to the game. Pei Qian opened a bottle of water. He started drinking it very happily, thinking of his 300,000 that would fall into his hands in a few days. He was only asked to wait until the next conclusion. Suddenly Ma Yang shouted for him to come and take a look. The man had stars in his eyes. He exclaimed enthusiastically that the number of downloads had increased, and many players even left reviews and 5 stars. Hearing this, the man in disbelief vomited out all the water he swallowed like a fountain and asked in shock what Ma Yang was talking about. Under the game is written the number of comments, which amount to more than 1236 players, and under that number there is an average rating, which is 5 stars. 12 out of 34 people left a review for the game. In the comments search filter, Ma Yang rated it very well on 1768 reviews. According to the filter that came out, the first review came from someone with the nickname Evil Smiling. He gave 5 stars, and his comment was written 64 hours ago. Comment says that this is the best game ever played. This player should not doubt his comment. He also complains that other games are not so good. This person's comments are liked by 2568 people. After that, there were negative comments that didn't recommend the game, and the comments came from Mysterious Force from the East, saying it was more expensive than the Three Kingdoms. Of course, no one liked this comment. Moreover, he was even answered saying that he didn't even play the game. Then why he complains that the game is expensive, even though the cost of the game is very cheap. Another person explained why the first people valued the game so much, saying that the main point is that they can only buy a permanent membership card in the game. Another comment under this comment was surprised that everything can be obtained for only 40 yuan, and everyone will be the same. There is no trap or other trap. This person wrote that it is almost impossible to believe if you don't see it with your own eyes. Pei Qian read all these comments with a pale face. How could this be? Even why did the number of downloads suddenly increase so much to a few thousand? And why did the game have such good reviews and 5 stars was impossible? A bit he fell into his bed, putting his head under the pillow, thinking what was going on in this world, where he took the wrong path. Ma Yang, who unlike his friends is in 7th heaven, happily calls out to him in the courtyard. Pei Qian, who falls into despair, asks him what he wants. Ma Yang beamed with happiness, saying that he knew that Pei Qian put a lot of effort into the game. Probably why he was so happy, because the hard times were over and everything was fine now. But it was better for him not to do it again because it's bad for his health. Pei Qian pretends to be happy and fakes a smile. She says that they did, even though mentally she wonders if she looks happy because she's desperate. He clenched his fists and got out of bed thinking that the terror was going to happen. Didn't want to drag on in grief. He had to see what went wrong, so that in the future he doesn't step on the same rake. Wasting the comments, he found similarities in them. For example, one of the comments said that he did not think that the characters of the Three Kingdoms could be portrayed in such an unconventional way. He praised, saying that the character designs are expressive and diverse, although most of the content is mediocre but still very fresh. Others say the graphics are amazing. This person started playing because they wanted to spend money on it. But seeing that there was nowhere to spend money, he decided to leave a 5-star review of cheats like Pei Qian commented. Thinking about the fact that most players mention art, no wonder they like it. But how do they know about the art of the game? Then, thinking of something, he decided to check his guess and immediately typed the name of his game in the search engine and found an ad post doing this that was able to force so many experts to repost and promote Ghost General. Suddenly, a realization came to him as only one person could do it. In principle, only 3 people knew about the game. He is Ma Yang and the artist he is, and Ma Yang does not advertise anything and does not spend time on it, and only artists keep this in mind. He immediately went to write to him, thinking to himself that it was about this artist. Why would he promote such a game? Did he have a lot of free time or something? He wrote to Guangjian, asking if he was the one helping Ghost General's promotion. The artist immediately replied, saying that he had asked several artist friends to share the recording. Guangjian thought that it was unfair that Pei Qian had invested so much money and flew by the artist, saying that he and his friends were touched by the fact that the man had 300,000 and he spent all his money on the development of the game and not on the promotion. Not to mention the quality of the game is not too bad. Of course, the picture is not bad either. Good review. Guangjian said in the end that he did nothing at all. Angry with annoyance, Pei Qian sarcastically thanked this artist. But of course, the sarcasm couldn't be conveyed via text, so the artist understood thanks in his own way, and wished Pei Qian good luck. And also Guanzhang said that he was sure that Pei Qian would be able to make even better plays, and he looked forward to cooperating with him in the future. This week passed in the blink of an eye, but for Pei Qian, it was the worst week of her life. Although he still had a glimmer of hope for today's summary, but there were few of them now he was standing on the balcony looking at the sky nicely, or to others it might appear that way, but actually he was looking at the system window. As usual, at the beginning is the name of the owner, namely Pei Qian, and then in the second paragraph there is a system account of 514,723.5 and a personal account of 224.5 units. In the next paragraph there is a sum download in the conversion, and finally the system account is 514,723.5. In the personal account is 2,371.8 yuan. He only earned 2,147.2 yuan out of the 300,000 yuan he should have been. Pei Qian thought about the injustice of the world for a week. The Ghost General's income was 500,000, so the total amount was 1 million games paid off in a week, and even earned 200,000. But only 2,000 yuan entered his personal account was a fair cry. He's screaming about how much of this injustice, even though he was expecting it. But his mental balance collapsed. After a while, the next window of the wealth conversion system came out. It said that the next sum would be done in 90 days. That is 3 months. In the next paragraph, it says that the next replenishment of the system account will be 500,000. Then it says that there are already more than 500,000 in the system account. So there is no deposit. Now there are 514,723.5 yuan in the system account, and 2,371.8 yuan in the personal account. After that, a new window comes out with an explanation that the system will refill the system account from time to time. The time of addition and addition of accounts will be different each time. But if the system account has more than the target amount, no addition will occur during the addition. Seeing this message, the man is really depressed. In the first week, 500,000 already got from his profits. There will be more next week, and the sum is only in 3 months. If he was honest with his calculations, then in 3 months the sum would reach 6 million. If he rented an office, it was more expensive, it would cost around 400,000 a month. If he hires about 30 more employees, paying 200,000 a month. And if he calculates the equipment for work, and he will earn 1 million yuan, Pei Qian complains that things are very difficult. He has to find office rental workers, buy equipment which he has never done before. While reciting everything that was on her mind, she gasped when she was patted on the shoulder by Ma Yang with a twinkle in her eye, and her stupid yellow sweater telling the man that the game was becoming popular, and that meant they could eat something expensive. Pei Qian smiled, saying that of course they could. This Pei Qian thought to himself that he had promised Ma Yang that when they started getting the money, he would take it to the buffet. Going down the stairs, Ma Yang asked the man. For some reason, he thought that even though the game was successful, but Pei Qian was thinking about something. While waving to his friend, Pei Qian smiled, telling him not to sweat. It was just that recently, Pei Qian was busy because of the game, and because of that, he was tired and needed some rest. Ma Yang smiled and slapped his friend on the back, saying that after all, he was now barefoot. So why didn't he take care of himself? He still does everything himself, but he can hire an assistant and give him all the work because it's so cool. Surprised by the offer, the guy starts to think about Ma Yang, introduces a beautiful girl with purple eyes and the same hair color in an office uniform in a car. He said this happens in many TV series. The president of the company drives luxury cars and flirts with girls while his assistant does his job. As they say, if there is work entrusted to the secretary, it means he has no job. Ma Yang's mouth watered, and Pei Qian, he thought of something else. He decided to hire an assistant to help him spend the money. Pei Qian slapped his friend on the shoulder. The man said that Ma Yang was just a genius. He really needed an assistant, or rather the assistant had to be a professional who could do anything. With such an assistant, he will have people who will help him spend money, rent offices, hire workers, and buy equipment. Pei Qian clenched his fists, and he was filled with energy. Sometime later, at the Exxon Headhunting Company Customer Service Center, Pei Qian was sitting in a black chair in the office. The office was very simply furnished, a long chair beside the wall where calligraphy hung with the inscription that heaven rewards the diligent. There was a small table in front of the chair, and on either side of the table was a single chair, and there was a bookshelf in the corner, and the floor was laminated. Then a man in a black tuxedo and glasses and a folder in his hands walked into the office and greeted Pei Qian. Addressing him as Boss Pei, he introduced himself as the regional manager of a company located in Handong Province. He also said that he was happy to meet Pei Qian and asked to call him Lawrence. Pei Qian got up from his seat and shook Lawrence's hand. Pei Qian says that she is happy to meet him, and turned to the manager. Lawrence said that his goals were simple. Namely, he needed a good assistant. Lawrence nodded with a smile and asked Pei Qian to tell him his special requirements. Pei Qian said with a smile that he needed the highest-paid assistant. Lawrence, after sorting out the documents, placed it in front of the man on the table and took out the people's case files and started going through them carefully while listening to Lawrence's manager. Lawrence also said that these are the most talented candidates in Handong Province. Their employees have communicated with them, and they are all competent and disciplined. They had very good speeches and behavior. Pei Qian, who was looking through the assistant case documents, stopped at one and said that Xin Hailu used to work as assistant vice president of a well-known foreign company. Why did she stop there? Is nothing written about this in the resume hearing? Lawrence smiled awkwardly and said that it seemed that Pei Qian rarely watched the news. Pei Qian tilted his head and asked what the news was about, and Lawrence's manager began to explain the fact that the vice president was drunk. It was indecent to think, but he didn't expect that he was faced with a tough cookie in the form of this girl. He slapped the vice president so that he fell to the ground and his wig flew off from his head and dentures from his mouth. As a result of this conflict, the fat vice president is fired and Assistant Xin decides to go it alone. Surprised by these stories, Pei Qian gave a thumbs up, saying that this girl looks like Wonder Woman. After deciding, he said he chose it, but he also said he had one request. The manager Lawrence smiled and said of course they could discuss all. The guy held up his finger and said he should offer something only when I asked him about it. In other cases, he should silently follow instructions and not ask anything. Lawrence, still smiling, said it was only natural since this was the professionalism expected of a chief assistant. 3 days have passed and Monday has arrived in a city of skyscrapers everywhere. A black car is driving towards one of the streets. Students, old people, newlyweds, and many others turned in surprise to the car and stopped to see feet in black shoes coming out of it. And then the owner of these smooth and light legs appeared, a beautiful girl with long, loose black hair reaching her back. She had the look pumpkin-colored eyes betray her mysterious charm. She is wearing a black dress with a neckline and a cream suit over this dress which suits her perfectly, and her image is very good. Her lips are slightly tinted red which completes her whole businessman image. This is Xin Hailu, Assistant Chief of Tengda Network Technology Co. Limited, and his monthly salary is 30,000. He turned the car towards another door and opened his door, telling Pei Qian, addressing him as Boss Pei, that they had arrived. Feeling this for the first time, Pei Qian was subtly surprised, but still got out of the car, which didn't suit him at all. After all, he was dressed like the last redneck. He was still wearing the same white hoodie with a blue blazer, completing the image of a student, black jeans and simple cat shoes, standing in victory pose. The man looked at the tall building and thought that the most expensive and most luxurious building in all of Jingzhou. Now he was here. On the 17th floor, the elevator stops, and 3 people come out with an amazing office lady, a talentless student, and a man in a white jacket and black trousers who is the representative of the building. She just says that if Pei Qian doesn't want to cross paths with another company, she can hire all floors recommended by the employee. The 17th floor, which had the best view in the nice landscape towards the Iron Courtyard Road, started to look around with his hand in his jacket pocket and saw that the view from the street was very good. From here you can see the forest and the lake. The employee smiled, saying that if they are a young company, the state provides subsidies, and they also allow you to pay only a month in advance and the payment will be returned monthly to Pei Qian. The employee asked about the price, and he said for Pei Qian, it was only 4 yuan per square meter. The employees smiled, saying that it might be expensive for Jingzhou, but they guaranteed quality renting an office here would help them make the right impression of their company. The employee didn't have time to finish his sentence. Pei Qian was surprised to say it was quite cheap, which of course shocked the employee, while the employee thought that this rich man looked too ordinary and scratched his head, and then looked at the secretary. He thought that even though Pei Qian couldn't worry about his wealth because he hired Xin Hailu. Pei Qian himself was thinking about it. At that time, this floor was about 3,000 square meters. If you counted about 4 yuan per meter, about 450,000 would come out in a month. While scratching the chin of the man's side, thinking that if he deducted 1 yuan, it would be 90,000 less than his estimate every month. The employees saw that he was smiling with concern and asked if he liked this place. Pei Qian raised his hand, saying that he rented this floor and thought that he would spend as much as he could as long as the ghost general brought in so much money. Hand in hand, happy employees say they are signing contract now. When Pei Qian was alone with the secretary in this room, he raised his finger and said that a good environment contributes to the high efficiency of employees, and it will also help improve the company's image. The secretary listens to her starts to write down the important points in her diary. Then she points to the place and says that office desk must be expensive, and then dryly says that it is not only expensive but also stylish. And there with her is a large, expensive office desk, stylish. Behind him is a buffet with books, and in front of the desk is a high-quality office chair, and also there is a laptop on the table pointing elsewhere. He said that the computer must of course be the best. Only the keyboard and mouse are mechanical high quality, and of course, 2 monitors. Now is the era of information society, and they are a gaming company, so computers play a vital role in their productivity. Of course, they don't forget the comfortable chairs. Pointing to another corner, he also said that they must have plants. When the workers are tired, they can look at the plants and relax. Plants are hard to care for, so they also need special workers who will take care of this. Pointing to the other side, Pei Qian said that a small gym can be arranged here. Working in the game industry weakens the body, so it is important to maintain health. Only then is it possible to work efficiently. Of course, the gym should have the most advanced tools for the latest treadmills. Scratching her chin, Pei Qian kept talking about what her office needed, or rather needed, to have a sofa and a coffee table. In the better reception area, there is also a high-quality tea set. They should buy several types of tea and coffee so they have something to offer their partners during negotiations. The secretary who wrote everything down said that she understood and would do everything as soon as possible. And then she asked what the budget for all this was. Pretending to think, the man starts checking the limits of what the system allows and says he got 500K or 800,000. Seeing that the system is silent, he is happy internally and says that he will give 800,000. Seeing the sight of the man happy, 700,000 for rent per month and 800,000 worth of equipment, 1.5 million has been spent, and he thinks this is a success. At a clothing store, Pei Qian tries on a fancy suit. Xin Hailu explained that the clothes Pei Qian wore were clothes from the JC brand, a luxury fashion brand dating back 100 years. They are known for their tailoring and customization. And if Pei Qian is still not satisfied, Xin Hailu suggests looking at other fancy suits, but getting the measurements will take a long time. Mick feels that this brand is enough. Xin Hailu then told him that plus the clothes Pei Qian was currently wearing, there were 3 suits that he would buy. The first one is more formal and suitable for important events. The other one can be used to chat with other presidents while attending award ceremonies. And the other 2 settings are more casual that can be used every day. Pei Qian agreed. Inside, Pei Qian was happy that there was no warning from the system, so he could buy this. Once approved, Xin Hailu ordered 2 suits each with different patterns and accessories. Pei Qian was satisfied with this result. Since she thinks Pei Qian is busy, Xin Hailu offers herself to buy it later to lessen Pei Qian's hassle. Pei Qian takes pride in his professionalism. On the way home, Xin Hailu gave him a list of items purchased after the previous discussion and asked Pei Qian to check them out. 1 yellow wood bonsai 988 won, 10 chestnut trees 188 wen per tree, luxury sofa 60,000, handcrafted silver teaware 22,000, natural Duan Yan placemat 13,000, and tea leaves, luxury gaming desk and chair, best computer, 2 high refresh rate gaming monitors, and keyboard. The total is 600,000 in all. Xin Hailu explained that all the products were obtained from places that could be trusted and everything was bought at a lower price. This way the company will not spend money in vain. They finally arrived at their destination. Pei Qian felt impressed to see the place. Xin Hailu told him that he had rented a 2-room apartment according to instructions, and then gave him the access card and apartment key. As Pei Qian expected, the system gave him no warning because buying clothes and renting a house had nothing to do with the company's business. But it concerns the problem of the boss's image. Since today's work was over, Xin Hailu asked Pei Qian to rest. Before he came down, Pei Qian said that a week after this, he would be interviewing applicants in the small meeting room. So during that time, Pei Qian said that he would trouble Xin Hailu with preparing the documents. Of course, Xin Hailu didn't mind because it was his duty. Xin Hailu finally went home. Since they finished buying clothes and renting rooms, Pei Qian thought that now was the time to choose who to recruit. The person he needs can't be too perfect as that would ruin his plans. But it can't be too useful either because you still need to make games, because otherwise you won't be able to meet the system requirements. If Pei Qian searched online, it would only attract people who thought it would qualify. But he also can't add to come to spend time on recruiting requirements either. This led Pei Qian to a dead end, but he remembered that in that year, apart from Ma Yang, there were other talents in Handong University. He decided to go where that person might be. Previously in the first year, Pei Qian remembered that person was always quiet at the internet cafe and rarely came back to the dormitory. He also never changes clothes. In summer, everyone changes to short sleeves, but that person still wears a sweater. That person was dismissed from school due to many failed classes. He worked on upgrading servers and selling in-game equipment to survive, and lived in an internet cafe 2 to 3 years later. After searching the internet cafe, Pei Qian finally found the person, the one who was called Spring Trousers, the king of grinding in the game, Bai Shu. With his lifeless eyes, Bai Shu was seen playing a game. Pei Qian approached him and called his name. Bai Shu looks confused and asks if Pei Qian is sure he's looking for her. Pei Qian then told him that he had a job and offered Bai Shu the job. Pei Qian thought that the system would not complain even if he recruited Bai Shu with a high salary. Bai Shu is a hardcore gamer, but being good at playing games doesn't mean you are good at making games. So Pei Qian was sure that Bai Shu would mess things up. Thinking that Pei Qian offered him to become an internet cafe manager, Bai Shu refused Pei Qian's offer. Pei Qian also told him that it wasn't his job, but to be a game designer. He then gave Bai Shu a down payment if he was interested. In addition, he told me that his company had the best computer with 2 monitors, so Bai Shu could play as he pleased. Bai Shu was shocked and couldn't believe Pei Qian was serious. He then asked what his job was. Pei Qian also explained that his job is to play games. He has to try games made by other people and games made by his company. And if there is a problem with the game, Bai Shu must notify him as soon as possible. He also informed that Bai Shu could participate in the design and provide input. Hearing the offer, Bai Shu lowered his head and said that he would consider it. Having nothing else to do, Pei Qian stood up and advised him to take a shower, get a haircut, and buy new clothes with the money. When she was about to leave the internet cafe, Pei Qian told her that her company was in Shenshua View, and when her work started, she would contact her by cell phone. With his hands shaking, Bai Shu reached for the money that Pei Qian left behind. Pei Qian's face filled with tears, seeing the money Pei Qian gave him. He was really happy because he was finally appreciated by someone. In front of Shenshua View, A young man was looking up at the tall building. That young man was the master planner of Shangyang Game, whose name was Huang Xibo. He wondered if the Tengda company that made Lonely Desert Highway and Ghost General was located in this place. After entering the building, Huang Xibo felt a little embarrassed to see other people wearing suits and started to walk towards the corner of the elevator. After arriving at the elevator door, he pressed the button to go up. When the elevator doors opened, inside was Old Liu, the chief planner of the Shangyang Game. Huang Xibo was shocked and wondered why Old Liu was here. Huang Xibo entered the elevator and greeted Old Liu, but with his makeup, Old Liu said that this company asked for many things, and he was sure that Huang Xibo would not be accepted. Because he thought that Huang Xibo still had free time for the interview, Old Liu was sure that Huang Xibo's work was still bad, and told him to work on the score table again when he came back. Hearing that made Huang Xibo shocked. He did not expect to run into Old Liu during the interview. He was wondering if Old Liu was here for an interview for Tengda too. Huang Xibo thought that Old Liu must have failed the interview based on his expression. Since Old Liu failed to enter, he thought that he would fail too. He finally arrived in front of Tengda's office and was greeted by two receptionists. They asked Huang Xibo if he had come for an interview. With his voice trembling, Huang Xibo replied that he had come for an interview and gave his name. Seeing them made Huang Xibo fascinated by the twin receptionists. One of the twin receptionists asked Huang Xibo to wait a moment to be informed to the interviewer, and the other twin receptionist asked Huang Xibo to follow him. While being led by the receptionist, Huang Xibo looked at the office, which looked luxurious but deserted. They finally arrived at the room they were headed for, and the receptionist knocked on the door of the room. After being given permission to enter, Pei Qian was already waiting. After introducing himself as the owner of Tengda, Pei Qian asked Old Liu's name to confirm and told him to sit down. Huang Xibo, who felt awkward, greeted Pei Qian good morning. After Huang Xibo sat down, Pei Qian offered him a glass of tea to drink while chatting. Looking at the glass made of silver, Huang Xibo felt impressed that Pei Qian didn't care about money. Pei Qian then asked Huang Xibo to talk about his work experience. According to his request, Huang Xibo began to share his work experience. After listening to Huang Xibo's work experience, Pei Qian smiled. Pei Qian was confused why Pei Qian smiled. He wonders if Pei Qian is laughing at him for daring to come to his company for an interview with his skills. Huang Xibo began to feel that a rookie like him who stepped foot into this industry would definitely not be accepted. However, contrary to Huang Xibo's expectations, Pei Qian said that Huang Xibo met the requirements well and asked when Old Liu could start work. The confused Huang Xibo replied that he could start work the day after tomorrow. Pei Qian then told Huang Xibo to bring the resignation letter the day after tomorrow so they could sign the work letter. After that, Pei Qian asked how much salary Huang Xibo wanted. Huang Xibo, who was a little embarrassed, asked if it was possible to earn 2,100 yuan per month. He thought that he had half a year of experience after changing jobs, so adding 500 yuan might not be a problem. Hearing that, Pei Qian sighed and looked disappointed. Huang Xibo panicked because he probably asked for too much. He hopes that at least his salary is the same as his previous office. Then what Pei Qian talked about next made Huang Xibo confused, because he talked about the cost of renting a room at Jingzhou, 1,000 yuan per month, and the cost of eating around 800 yuan per month. He then talked about buying 2 or 3 clothes a month, which cost 300 yuan, plus another 200 yuan for water and electricity. Apart from that, there are festivals or celebrations, buying lipstick and makeup for girlfriends. He also needs money to look after 300 yuan per month, and also 100 yuan for transportation and 500 yuan for monthly savings. Pei Qian explains that his company uses the national salary, so he pays taxes, insurance, and rent for the expenses of his employees. So in his opinion, Huang Xibo needed at least 3,500 yuan per month. Hearing that made Huang Xibo at a loss for words. Finally, Pei Qian offered Huang Xibo a salary of 4,000 yuan per month. Huang Xibo was shocked because Pei Qian actually offered his salary. He wondered if all rich people were like this. Since there was no reason to refuse, Huang Xibo accepted the offer. The interview ended, and Pei Qian welcomed Huang Xibo to his Tengda company and shook his hand. Huang Xibo finally finished his interview and left the room shaking. After Huang Xibo left, Pei Qian took out a pen and wrote notes about the candidates he interviewed today. She is happy as she will finish everything in a while. 1 week finally passed. When Ma Yang entered Tengda's office, he could see that it was almost full. As he was passing by the office, he could hear the employees cursing because his buff was stolen in the game. Apart from that, there are also employees who ask to be added as friends in the game during working hours. Ma Yang finally entered Pei Qian's room. Seeing Ma Yang coming, Pei Qian told him to come in and drink tea. Ma Yang then sat down and said that he was impressed by Pei Qian's high efficiency. Because the office was almost full, Ma Yang also asked if the recruitment was going well. Pei Qian replied that the recruitment was going well and gave the new recruits resumes. The more he looked at their resumes, the more astonished and shocked Ma Yang became. He was really shocked after seeing all the resumes. After checking everything out, Ma Yang realized that they weren't all that experienced for long. He then asked if the chief designer was hard to recruit because he didn't see any. Thinking that no one was proposing, Ma Yang suggested increasing his salary or trying to enlist the help of a headhunter. But Pei Qian says that's not the case. He told that there were several who applied to be the head designer, but he refused them all. Ma Yang was confused by Pei Qian's decision. After thinking about what reasons to give, Pei Qian said that first, their brains were too clumsy, so they couldn't accept any innovative ideas. And secondly, they ask for high salaries, but their performance is too low. The innocent Ma Yang finally understood Pei Qian's reasoning. Then finally Pei Qian said that their passion had started to fade. But even so, Ma Yang was still confused because without them, no one would lead the design for the game project. Pei Qian sighed and proudly said that he would do it. Since Pei Qian was the president, Ma Yang was still unsure about this and still thought that Pei Qian needed a chief designer to help. Pei Qian said that there would be someone named Huang Xibo who would help him. Ma Yang then checked Huang Xibo's resume. After knowing that Huang Xibo had only worked for half a year in the industry and wanted to be an admin planner, Ma Yang wondered if Huang Xibo could do it. Hearing that, Pei Qian told Ma Yang to not only look at his position, but also look at what he was doing. He said that most of the game data was done by Huang Xibo and implemented in the cloud editor. Huang Xibo did 80% of the dataset, so he was really the executive assistant to the chief designer. Ma Yang became impressed with Huang Xibo's talent. Because Huang Xibo was very talented, Ma Yang suggested Pei Qian to give him a chief designer salary because 4,000 yuan was too low. Pei Qian agreed with Ma Yang's words, but he couldn't be in a hurry, so if Huang Xibo's performance was good, he would raise him up. Besides that, Pei Qian told him that the other employees also had skills. Among them was Bai Shu, who was a master of all races for all races in Fantasy Word. He even had 6 accounts maxed out. Getting the party to get the expedition's first kill was an easy game for him. Ma Yang is once again impressed by new employee Pei Qian's talent. He also asked when they would start work. Pei Qian replied that since there was no time right now, he would start work tomorrow. The next day, Pei Qian asks all of his employees to stop work because he has an important announcement to make. The employees look impressed and fascinated to see their boss. After clearing his throat, Pei Qian said that he was sure they were ready to work, so he announced that starting tomorrow they would start work. The employees got excited because they could finally start developing the project. Huang Xibo felt that he was ready for the 996 that would hit him. But with a comfortable office environment, good salary, and a boss who appreciates his employees, Huang Xibo is sure that he can stand it. But when Huang Xibo got excited, Pei Qian said to celebrate tomorrow's workday, "Work ends today and everyone can go home now." Hearing that made Huang Xibo petrified. Huang Xibo was very confused and shocked because it was still 3 p.m. and they had already gone home.